Rabbi Leder, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Honored to be with you.
As I was telling you in the pre-interview, actually, I found out about you from my sister, who sent me an Instagram post of yours. And I read a couple of things. I was like, oh, this rabbi seems very interesting, very knowledgeable. Let me bring him on the podcast. And I downloaded your book. And as I read it, it was a big surprise. I wasn't expecting to be as emotional as I was because your book is about grief and loss and how to deal with that. And for those listeners who don't know, I lost my father 7 months ago. And the story is very similar to yours. So if you want to just kind of take us back, as to, the beauty of what remains, why you wrote this book, why it came about, and that way we can jump into the conversation.
Okay. Well, the backstory to the book is that 4 years ago, on my 30th anniversary of being the senior rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, I decided on Kol Nidre to give a sermon about 10 things death had come to teach me about life after 30 years of seeing so much death up close. At that point, I had officiated at over 1,000 funerals. And the reason I chose Kol Nidre to give that sermon is a lot of Jews don't even realize this, but Kol Nidre is actually meant to mimic death in many ways. It's sort of the Jewish Day of the Dead, Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur. And it's meant to force us to think about our deaths so that we change our lives. Because death is really, in my opinion, the only teacher, the only real teacher when it comes to embracing life. So, when you said it's a book about grief, people ask me, well, how did you spend 2 years writing a book about death? And I tell them I didn't. I spent 2 years writing a book about life and why it matters. But in any case, so I gave this sermon and it was a big hit and there were requests from all over the world and it blew up a little bit on the internet. And I thought I'd, done a really good job in this sermon. I first talked about how Yom Kippur mimics death. We wear white like a burial shroud. We fast because the dead neither eat nor drink. We begin the service by removing 3 Torahs from the Aron. They represent the 3 judges in the Beit Din Shel Mala, the heavenly court above. And the Hebrew word for ark, where we store the Torahs, Aron, is the same Hebrew word used for casket. So you can, if you're knowledgeable, you get the theater of it. There you are standing before the 3 judges, staring into your empty casket, and you have to make an account of your life. So I talked about this, and then I went on to talk about what so much death had taught me about life. And then 1 year to the day after I delivered that sermon, we buried my father in Minneapolis after a 10-year journey through Alzheimer's. The morning of the next Kol Nidre, we buried my father. And through that experience of being not Steve Leder, the rabbi, but Steve Leder, the son, I realized how much of that sermon from a year before, as I put it in the book, was just 1 degree shy of the deepest truth. It wasn't the whole truth. Because I learned things as the son I could never have learned as the rabbi, even after 1,000 funerals. So the book, in a way, was a kind of apology for that sermon. Like, here's what I used to think, and here's what I know now. And it also explores what psychologists would call the role tension between rabbi and son. And it's also a field guide for people who are facing loss, not just loss due to death, but any kind of loss, because there are common denominators to loss. There are many deaths. There's a death of a marriage. There's a death of a career. There's a death of a dream. There's a lot of ways in which we experience loss. So that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because I had learned something in that transition from rabbi to son that I wanted to share with people. And thankfully it's resonating. I have had many people say to me, this is, the first book I've read about loss that really tells the truth. And that I really felt like the writer was speaking to me in my experience. And we can get into it if you want to, but I can, we can get into what those major reframing it and readjustments were,
100%. I think that for me during this time, again, I think God works in miraculous ways. And I was given this gift of reading the book and getting to meet you. I first want to talk about, first of all, the book had so much story that pertained to my life, right? My father was a workaholic. He worked so much. He was a beautiful human being, but he really, really gave to his, I never played baseball with my father. After I broke my first finger at a sporting event, my father says, I'm bad luck. I'm not showing up to anything else again. If it wasn't in the pawn shop industry, which is where I used to work, he would say, how are you going to make money? This is how the family knows the business. So it really resonated with me because it was essentially the same story.
Yes.
And,
yes.
And you're right. I didn't know grief. I had been to friends' parents' funerals and close people's funerals. But when I said goodbye to my father in hospice inside the house, we were blessed to be able to do that. It was a pivotal moment in my life.
Yeah.
And
in what way was it pivotal? Because I'm wondering if it's similar to mine. In what way did you feel it was pivotal?
So first of
all,
what
did you realize in that moment?
So first of all, it was the hardest thing and the most beautiful thing I've ever done. 3 days with my father, knowing he's about to pass away.
Yeah.
Second of all, I don't think I've ever, and you mentioned this in the book, and
take your time.
I don't think I've ever thanked my father so much. I've ever touched my father so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I ever kissed him so much as that moment. And
in the book I talk about learning a new language together with my father, because at one point in the trajectory of the disease, my father lost his ability to speak. And we learned a whole new language together, which was the language of touch. I would sit in the nursing home with him for hours and just hold his hand in his wheelchair. And in many ways, it was the most intimate relationship of my life with my father. His vulnerability also made that possible. And that's, look, I called the book The Beauty of What Remains, because sometimes when things are taken away from us, that's when the beauty is revealed. It's almost like a statue, a beautiful marble statue. That beauty was always hiding within that block of marble, hiding in plain sight. But when the sculptor removes things, removes chip by chip by chip by chip, it leaves behind this beautiful statue. And I see death that way. I see the pandemic that way. I see all loss that way, that in this stripping away, what's left behind is really a distillate. It's essentialism. It's beautiful. And you have that forever with your dad, and I have it with mine. And some of what gets stripped away is the negative. I mean, my dad, as you know from the book, was not an easy guy to have as a father. He was not like other dads. And, and Alzheimer's, despite what it took away, it also rounded the sharp edges of my father's personality. And it gave me a way in that I hadn't had before.
Yeah. You asked me the pivotal moment, and you talk about erasing. My father went through Parkinson's and dementia for 10 years. Mm-hmm. And essentially it erased that. And it just left the beauty of those 3 days together and the memories that we had. Do you
think, for me, I will tell you my pivotal moment, and I'm wondering if the subtext of what you said is the same. So, I've stood shoulder to shoulder with families looking at the dead body of their loved one literally 1,000 times and pretty much unfazed by it. I mean, to be honest, I could eat a sandwich and stand next to someone looking at a dead body, because I'm a professional in that way.
Yeah.
But when the rabbi of my parents' synagogue walked us in to see my father's body in the casket before it was closed and the service would begin, you know, I knew exactly how the rabbi felt. I had no idea how I would feel. And my father and I were almost identical physically. I'm 61. If you looked at a picture of my father when he was my age, you really couldn't tell the difference between us. And that was true my whole life. And so when I looked into the casket, my pivotal realization or moment was, I thought to myself, that's how I'm going to look when I'm dead. And my son is bending over my casket. In other words, that was the moment at 58 years old that I realized, really realized, I was going to die. And therefore, I had to really live.
Yes. You called it the subtext, and it's the text.
Yeah.
After my father passed away, I told my wife, I said, I'm done living for others. I'm done doing, saying things that I don't want to say, or just holding myself back, because my father passed away at 69, very early.
Yes.
And he always said, I'm going to work hard today so I can take your mother on trips. I'm going to work hard today so I can, play with my grandkids.
Yeah.
Yet those days were filled with caregivers and wiping his ass, excuse me, and
yes.
not those beautiful vacations.
That's right.
He envisioned.
Yes. And it's really, Kafka said the meaning of life is that it ends.
Yeah.
And it's really true. And I think it takes something like the death of a parent to shake us by the shoulders and wake us up. Even, you see, this is the thing that's so interesting, at least to me, is even a death professional, like I was, or thought I was, had no idea what it was really all about until it was my dad. And I think that in its own way is also beautiful. That at my age, I could be awakened to a deeper truth. Once again, my father was teaching me. My father has continued to teach me in death the way he taught me in life.
Yeah. I don't know about you. I mean, I lost my father 7 months ago. I feel my father all the time. I have conversations with my father.
Yes.
When I wrap the talit around my head, I feel my father giving me a hug.
Yeah.
And that's why I do it. Let me ask you this question. I've heard a lot of people say, a lot of my friends who their fathers passed, they say, you don't become a real man until you lose your father. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in a way it's true. I think there are many levels of manhood, and I think that's one of them, is when you are a fatherless man. But there are others. I think having a child makes you a grown man in a different way. I think having cancer or getting fired or having to wrestle with an addiction, or having to suffer through some terribly embarrassing moment in life, I think a car accident. I think there are many things that accelerate our growth. There's this concept, I'm going to go on what seems like a tangent, but it's not. When you talk about evolution, most people think of evolution as a species on a constantly ascending line. Like the line is always ascending at a steady rate, and we are constantly evolving at a steady rate. But biologists actually think it's much more something they call punctuated equilibrium. That a species is going along on a flat line on a plateau, and then something cataclysmic happens, something punctuates the equilibrium, and the development shoots up, right? It evolves very quickly. Mm-hmm. I think that's true for men with various life experiences. We go along on a very sort of, we're plateaued, and then something happens that punctuates our equilibrium, and we grow, right? And that's what and so I see manhood as this plateau, punctuation, plateau, punctuation, plateau, punctuation. And definitely for me, there were two things that were the great accelerators in my life in terms of punctuating the equilibrium of my life. The first was when I was in a very frightening car accident about 6 years ago. And I was basically paralyzed from the waist down temporarily, and had to have spinal surgery and got addicted to opioids. And I actually wrote the book before this one about it. It's called More Beautiful Than Before: How Suffering Transforms Us. And being in chronic pain, I mean like torturous pain, that really taught me a lot. It taught me humility. It taught me to reach out for help. It taught me about depression in a way I'd never understood it before. It taught me about addiction in a way I'd never understood it before. So that was the first. And the second was the death of my father. And, you know, I don't welcome these things. I don't go looking for them, but I will say that in both cases, they have made my life more meaningful and therefore more beautiful. And no, it's not worth it. Right? I mean, that's the thing. I wish I didn't have the car accident and I was a little dumber about life, but we don't get to choose that. And, you know, as I said in that book, if you have to go through hell, don't come out empty-handed. I think that's the real point, right?
I love that. Let's dive into kind of the concepts of the beauty of what remains and grief.
Yes.
You know, going through my grief, you talk about that people say that, oh, you know, grief comes in stages. And yeah. What you actually say is that it comes in waves.
That's right. I think, you know, I told you I'm 61. So my generation and everyone to follow was raised in terms of thinking about grief. We were all influenced and raised in one way or another by the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who divided dying and death and grief into stages. And stages implies that grief is linear, right? That first you feel A, then B, then C, then D, then E, and then you're done. You're at the end of grief. And I say in the book, anyone who thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line does not understand grief.
Yeah.
Grief is nonlinear. And you're right, I do prefer a wave metaphor. At least that worked much better for me to help me understand where I was. In that chapter I call an ocean of grief. So the reason waves work for me as a metaphor is that waves, they never stop. But at first they come very close together and they're very powerful. And then they do spread out. They become less frequent. And then sometimes you get days, weeks, months, years even, of beautiful calm seas. But your back is turned one day and something happens and a massive rogue wave of grief just rises up and crashes down on you, right? You know, I see this, for example, under the chuppah at weddings, where the grandfather of the bride will just start weeping because he misses his wife who died 20 years ago. And he's been fine. He's remarried. He's fine. And then boom, it just comes crashing down. So that's the first thing. Now, to extend this wave metaphor further in a helpful way, I hope, you know, for me, the Rabbi Steve Leder, before I became a bereaved son, my default setting when it came to waves, no matter what, a wave of anxiety, a wave of grief, a wave of hard work that was coming my way, you know, whatever the challenge was, no matter how large the wave, my default setting was, I'm going to plant my feet in the sand, chest forward, and I'm going to hold my ground because I am more powerful than any wave. And we know what happens, right? When you do that,
100%. You get face in the sand. You can't come. Right. You don't know what side you're coming up on.
That's right. And so, what I learned from grief is there's a better way to deal with these waves, which is when you see it or feel it coming at you, just lie down and let it wash over you, and just float with it. Just float with it until you can stand up again. And, if you have to pull off the freeway to cry, pull off the freeway and cry. Just let it wash over you. And by the way, the other thing I learned this from that chronic pain too. While you're floating with this grief, it's a good idea to reach your hand out and see if there's somebody there who will grab your hand and hold you while you're floating and help you stand again. Because the answer is usually yes, there is, if you're willing to reach your hand out. There's so many times when I just turn to my wife and I just say, I miss my dad so much right now. Or, my dad would have loved this. It happened on Father's Day. We had my favorite dessert on Father's Day, which is a hot fudge sundae. And it was my dad's favorite. And I just looked around the table and I said to my kids and my wife, Papa would have loved this, and I was grieving and they just held my hand, they were there with me in it. So for me, understanding it as waves, understanding it as something that becomes less frequent, but never less sad and never less beautiful, is a very helpful way of understanding grief.
I love that you always add beauty to what you say, because I think there's a beauty to learning it. Let me ask you this question. With what you just said, as men, this is the Tribesmen podcast, as men, we put our feet in the sand and we want to hold strong for many things.
Yes.
Work and the wife and the baby, and this is going on, and taking care of my mom who had a stroke, and yet at times I give myself that moment, that space to grieve. Mm-hmm. And at times I think to myself, I don't have the time, let's keep moving on. And all that happens is it builds up even stronger.
Well, that's right. If you kick the can down the road, let me just put it this way. Other than wine and scotch, very few things get better by waiting. Okay? And grief is not one of them.
Yeah.
So, and I also think, I'm so glad you're doing this podcast and this work. The first article I ever got paid for, I still have a photocopy of the check, was an article I wrote probably 30 years ago for Playboy magazine for a column that was called Man Track. And it was called God's Loneliest Creatures. And it was what I had learned about men as a rabbi from what they came to talk with me about in my office on what I call my couch of tears. And it was called God's Loneliest Creatures. And it's because men, we were taught mostly by our fathers or coaches or both, and every movie we ever saw, that the heroic thing to do is to go it alone. When actually, that is the most foolish way to go through life and the most painful way to go through life. No one suffers pain better alone. No one. No one. I'll just share one study with you. They did a study where they asked college kids to sit alone in a room and put their feet in a bucket of ice water. And then they timed how long they could keep their feet in the ice water. Then they ran the same experiment, but there was someone in the room with each kid as he or she put his or her feet in the ice water. And with someone else in the room, they were able to keep their feet in the ice water. In other words, to endure the pain much longer.
Wow.
So, one of the most important things, grief, look, that's why we have Shiva, that's why we have a minyan, is not to go it alone, right? There are people who love you and people care about you, and you can rest upon them and lean upon them. And by the way, they're glad to be there for you. And some of them will disappoint you, yes. And the way I think about that is when when you reach out for help as a man, the people who matter don't mind. And the people who mind, they don't matter.
You know, you bring up minyan, and you know, I go say Kaddish whenever I can. And there's a beauty to sitting in a room with 9 other men. Hopefully there's more. And just being there, meditating together, praying together. And you said something that's amazing. I also dove into the last book, by the way, which I loved. You said something about, like, you know, praying doesn't heal.
No, it doesn't cure, but it doesn't
cure. Praying doesn't cure, but rather it heals.
That's right.
And for me, saying, you know, Kaddish for my father, it's a healing moment. It's that moment of taking that grief and externalizing it without tears, essentially, that I'm here, I'm grieving, and I'm saying this prayer. And
the prayer itself, as you know, does not contain a single reference to death.
Correct.
It's an affirmational statement about the glory and the power and the beauty of God. Yeah. And by the way, I think it's quite significant. It must be said standing, right? When you feel low, when you feel grief, the tradition says stand up and praise God, right? Affirm what you cannot even see right now.
Amazing.
You know, it's like that psalm, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. You keep walking, you keep putting one foot in front of the other with a sense of faith that at some point you come out the other end.
You mentioned something in this book that obviously I want to ask you a question about. That was very, very interesting. You said that no one who you have visited on their deathbed is afraid.
Yes. They're not afraid for themselves.
They're not afraid for themselves, correct. Yet, while we're living, we give ourselves anxiety about the smallest things. Yet those who are about to, you know, meet their maker, meet God, there's no fear, there's a calm for themselves. For me, that's actually funny in a satirical way, where we're sitting here living, yet we've got all this anxiety, and they're about to go, and they're not afraid. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is Shakespeare's line, "Lord, what fools these mortals be," you know. It has been my experience, and my experience is anecdotal, but it's pretty large. When I have never, ever, and I ask every time when I'm at the bedside of a dying person, and by dying, I mean actively dying, you know, hours, a day, maybe 2 away from dying. And I ask, are you afraid? And the answer 100% of the time is no. Now, for themselves, they may be worried about their wife. They may be worried about their kids, which is why you have to reassure the dying that you're going to be okay, even if you're not sure you're going to be okay. It's kind of like telling a little kid the plane's not going to crash. You know it might, but you don't need to share that with that little kid. So I have never encountered a person who is actively dying who's been afraid for him or herself. Was your father?
No,
the last day of his life?
You know, it's funny. We said goodbye. We walked out and we said, "Dad, we got you. Like we're okay." We walked out, and that's when he left.
Yeah, you assured him you were okay, but he, during that last day or 2 of his life,
did not seem like it.
No. And had you asked him, I would bet he would have said no. So now, why is this important? Well, first of all, it hopefully will help people who are afraid of dying. And one of the sort of counterintuitive things that it really is helpful when you know this is it means if you're worried about dying, it's not your day. You're fine. Yeah. So anxiety is for the living. So when people come to me with this, "Rabbi, I can't help it, I'm so afraid of dying," I said, well, then that means you're not dying. So enjoy it. It's not your day. Now, of course, sometimes people get hit by a bus or a car and something tragic happens. But generally speaking, if you're afraid of dying, that's not the day you're dying. Yeah. Because when the day you're dying arrives, you will not be afraid. And this is very comforting for many people. It's comforting for me when I worry about it.
Yeah. You've talked about catastrophizing in both books, essentially, right? How people suffer so much, you know, depression and anxiety because of this catastrophizing that something's going to happen, God forbid.
Well, it's a tricky thing. It's really not clear whether they catastrophize because they're anxious or they're anxious because they catastrophize. right?
Yeah.
So, and I suffer, by the way, from anxiety. I have an underlying mood disorder and an anxiety disorder, and I've worked really hard to understand it. It goes way back to my childhood and the kind of father I had, and his fear of poverty and my therefore fear of poverty. Like, I understand where it comes from, but that doesn't mean I can always control it.
Yeah.
And I sublimated my anxiety for most of my life by working brutally hard almost all the time. That's how I sublimated and controlled my anxiety. But for example, during the pandemic, when all of us had no choice but to ease up a little bit, it reared its ugly head, so, and yes, I catastrophized the future. I think the whole world was catastrophizing the future at the time. So it's really both. It's sometimes we catastrophize because we're anxious, and sometimes we're anxious because we catastrophize the future. And all I can tell you is it is so important to get help if you suffer from anxiety. And, anxiety and depression are like siblings.
Yeah.
So it's rare that you have one without the other.
And I think as we're talking about grief, it kind of can morph into that, right? I was holding back, not going to therapy. I was, down and depressed. My father had passed away, went to therapy and still going on a weekly basis.
Good for you.
Realizing that that's the grief I was not dealing with.
Right.
I wasn't seeing this as grief. My wife was a little bit worried. What's going on? Let's talk more about, kind of the concepts of that, dealing with grief, and how we can see the beauty of dealing with the loss of loved one.
Well, there's a duality to grief, and a duality to memory, which is, it's not only painful, it's also beautiful. And you cannot have one without the other. I cannot remember the beautiful things about my father and the way he still rings in my ear. And, there's so many times when I'm in a situation or meeting someone and I know exactly what my father would say. I know exactly which dirty Yiddish word he would use. And there's no question about it. Or Father's Day, barbecue, when I was eating that hot fudge sundae, he was there with me. And that's beautiful, and it's painful. And you cannot have one without the other, but that doesn't mean it's only painful, right? There's a duality to grief. There's a duality to memory. In the book, I say it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? That's grief. And I think making peace with the duality of it, the dissonance, I have found in therapy that so much of anxiety and tension is about cognitive dissonance. And we all have cognitive dissonance vis-a-vis our parents, all of us. We love them, we hate them, we love them, we hate them. All you have to do is raise a teenager to see that, right?
I'm getting close to that. So
okay, well, you're going to see a lot of dissonance in your house for a decade. So I think that one of the things I try to do in the book is be honest about that dissonance for people so they can understand what they're feeling really is grief, both the positive and beautiful side of grief, which is these memories that sustain us, and the painful side of grief, which is these memories that sustain us. It's both. There's an old Yiddish expression that says God doesn't give with both hands, and it's true. It's true. And, I thought President Biden, who obviously, we all know has suffered tremendous loss in his life, I thought he said it really well in his inaugural address when he said, in order to heal, we have to remember, and it hurts to remember sometimes. And I don't think I can say it better than that. I think that's the truth. And knowing it, I think is helpful.
Does that touch on guilt at all? I know that when somebody loses somebody, it went through me. I wasn't there for my father enough. I should have, gone to see him more. I should have held his hand more.
Yeah.
How do we deal with, the guilt within the grief so that we can just grieve and not have the guilt?
Well, I can tell you how I deal with it because, my father died in the middle of the night and I was 2,000 miles away. And he had Alzheimer's for 10 years, and I was often 2,000 miles away. And what I would say to you, Yigal, is, you can dwell on not having been there for your father enough in death. But my question is, were you there with him in life? And if the answer to that is yes, you'll learn to live with not having been there with him in death.
I love that.
You will,
great.
because my sense of you and your father is there was no unfinished business, and you loved him deeply, and you had a close, tight relationship in life. And so the fact that you could have shown up 2 more times than those last 3 days, you'll learn to live with it, because what's really important is your father's life, not his death.
Yeah. And I think that's what we talk about when we say legacy, right? Like, what legacy did my father leave? And anybody.
And do you have a son?
I have 3 daughters.
Okay, so you have 3 daughters. So I'll ask you about your daughters. Put yourself in your father's position. If your daughters will be with you in life the way you were with your father in life, do you think you're going to care if they show up 5 times or 6 times the last 3 days of your life?
No,
you're not.
No.
So I think you're good.
What you just said brought something up, which is forgiveness.
Mm.
And I was, I'm sure this happened to you with the story of your father in the book. At some point, I was very angry with my father. You weren't there. You didn't play ball with me. You didn't, show up to things. And it wasn't until, the days before his passing where I just said, like, enough is enough, Yigal. Actually, I remember it perfectly. It was Wednesday. I was at my therapist's office, and I said, I think it's time that I forgive my father. I'm done. And that night is when he aspirated on the food. He went to the hospital,
got pneumonia,
and he came back to hospice and passed away. And when he was sitting there in bed in the house, I said, Dad, I forgive you, and I hope that you forgive me. And I think that's important, that through grief is to be able to forgive. It was important for me to be able to give from myself and forgive my father for whatever he knew, because he was taught from his father, and his father was taught by his father. They didn't have coaches and life coaches and therapy. Like, they didn't use the resources that we have today.
Like us, our fathers did the best they could and the best they knew how. And all we can hope is that each generation improves upon the fatherhood of the generation before and holds on to the best of our fathers. It's this combination of what you choose to embrace and what you choose to let go of, what you choose to replicate and what you choose never to replicate. That's the art of living. And I actually, you're pointing to something I think very important, which is, absent the reality of death, I don't think we would ever make a craft and an art of our lives. I mean, imagine if we led deathless lives. We wouldn't care about anything.
Yeah.
We'd have no ambition. We wouldn't get married. We wouldn't have children. We wouldn't change anything. Nothing would matter, because nothing ends. Wallace Stevens, the poet, said, I'm paraphrasing, the beauty of a flower is that it fades. That's why nobody gives a shit about plastic flowers, because right? Because they have no death. They have no life. They don't matter.
And I think the courage that you talk about in the book, for me, is knowing that there's an end date and living life to the fullest every single day, because there is an end date. There is an expiration date. It's
right. I go back to Kafka, the meaning of life is that it ends.
Yeah.
And can you lead a meaningful and purposeful life, which is different than an easy life, by the way.
Totally.
Right. If you want to lead a meaningful and purposeful life, you are not going to lead an easy life, but you're going to lead a very rich life.
I love that. Rabbi Leder, I have one question for you that I asked my community to ask, and this is one that stuck out. Somebody asked, how would you encourage a family who has been fighting for a life of a loved one, and when is it okay to let go?
It's a very good question. I have found in all my years of being summoned to the ICU and asked that very question, I have found a single very helpful question that just kind of removes all the underbrush and clarifies the matter, which is this. Is what you are contemplating doing or not doing, but let's just make it in the affirmative, is the procedure you are contemplating doing now, let's say it's a feeding tube, is it going to prolong your loved one's life, or is it going to prolong your loved one's death? And to me, that's the only question. It is loving to prolong life, and it is cruel and selfish to prolong someone's death because you can't let go. Now, the next thing Yigal people say to me is, well, how do we know? How will we know? And my answer is the same as when Justice Potter Stewart was asked by the Supreme Court in a pornography case to define obscenity. You know what he said? He said, I can't define it, but I know when I see it. Yeah. Right? You'll know, in other words. You will know when you are crossing that line from prolonging life to prolonging death. And that will clarify the decision for you.
Rabbi Leder, this has been both an honor and therapeutic, speaking to a rabbi about grieving my father when I had no idea that this was going to be the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad the book has helped you, and you're walking through this valley of shadows. And I'll just leave you with one final thought about that. If you think deeply about a shadow, no matter how long, no matter how dark, it's actually proof that light is still shining. Because you cannot have a shadow unless a light is shining and it's obstructed. Otherwise, it would just be pure darkness, right? So grief is love obstructed. Grief is love obstructed. Your grief is a reflection of your deep and powerful and abiding love for your dad. And that's going to be with you, and that's going to hold you for the rest of your life.
And we end there. Tribesmen, thank you so much for joining us in the podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode. And don't forget to visit us in the Tribesmen Jewish Men Leading Facebook group. And as I always say, strength and courage. Chazak v'ematz.